So in this presentation, I'm going to cover known on-farm greenhouse gases and emissions and carbon storage. And let's see if this works. There we go. Excellent. So I'll quickly go over why this is being asked of all farmers and growers, and then provide some examples of real deer farms, available tools. So Sarah's already mentioned that Beef and Lamb have been sort of talking about what tools are available and ways to reduce emissions. So what is this all about? Well, successive New Zealand governments since the 1992 Kyoto Protocol have signalled to the world that New Zealand as a country would seek to reduce its overall greenhouse gas emissions. And the latest international agreement was the Paris Agreement, signed in 2015, which basically has the aim of limiting global warming to well below 2 and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius compared with pre-industrial levels. Also politically, this was signalled by Jacinda Ardern in 2017 in her election campaign launch speech, where she called climate change my generation's nuclear-free moment. So there's some political weight behind all of this. The government's domestic response to the Paris Agreement is contained in the 2019 Zero Carbon Act. And the main aims that relate to livestock farming are essentially these ones: to reduce net emissions of all greenhouse gases except biogenic methane to zero by 2050. So essentially for us, that's nitrous oxide. And then in terms of methane, reduce emissions of biogenic methane to 24 to 47% below 2017 levels by 2050. And then the third and final aim that's quite important for us is the establishment of a new independent climate change commission to provide expert advice and monitoring. And we'll touch upon that a little bit later on. So prior to this act, the government had proposed that all farmers would be required to enter the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, or ETS, whereby they would have to pay for their greenhouse gas emissions and receive any credit for ETS-eligible forestry blocks on their land. In response to this, an alternative to the ETS was proposed, a Waka Econo, that could be developed between agriculture, government, and Māori interests. So Waka Econo is quite a massive undertaking. There's 13 partner organisations, and it's divided into 6 working groups that feed into either policy development or policy implementation. It's got some very ambitious and gnarly deliverables, which are sort of outlined here, and which the Climate Change Commission, this independent body that provides advice, will be looking at very closely over the next few years. And really, for us, the most pressing deliverable coming up is for all farms to know their greenhouse gas number by the end of 2022. Now, whether or not we'll get there is another thing, but again, it's really what we show to the Climate Change Commission around our endeavours towards that, which will be quite important. So DINZ is heavily engaged in Waka Econo. Phil McKenzie is part of the implementation group, while I'm part of the policy development group. And in addition, we have a deer farmer as part of the sequestration working group. So, so you just see in that policy development, we've got those different working groups, and carbon on-farm sequestration is one of them. And we see that particular working group as crucial for our farmers. And in fact, we are the only industry organisation that has direct farmer input into a working group. Waka Econo also makes use of industry farmer reference groups. So for our reference group, we have our own DFA executive committee and the DINZ Environmental Stewardship Reference Group, again made up of predominantly farmers, and that forms our industry reference group for Waka Econo. There is also a pan-sector reference group which draws on farmers from across all the different industry organisations, and they meet a little bit more frequently. or the intention is for them to meet more frequently to hear what the work streams are up to. That contains 2 of our own farmers, as well as 2 other deer farmers that have been nominated from other industry bodies, arable and sheep and beef. So as an industry, we're reasonably well represented there. So that's really what we're sort of working on in Wellington. And in terms of what can you do around knowing your greenhouse number, although we do not yet know what the price of the emissions will be, and that's quite important, at least knowing the amount of emissions will be an indication of the size of the problem. So is it a $5,000 problem or is it a $50,000 problem? So with the goal of having farmers know their greenhouse gas numbers, what can you do? We can go, as a rough indication, we can go right back to 2016 when the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment used national inventory data, so this is pretty average, rough and really average, to estimate livestock emissions. And back then they were looking at methane and nitrous oxide combined. They also then provided an equivalent area of forest that would account for these emissions. So you'll see here, this is one for native forest, and looking at how much would be required to offset 100 of any of these animals. So the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment only looked at sheep, beef and dairy, and so I've just added in the deer, which you can see is sort of a bit more closer towards sheep than to beef. Here's the same sort of calculations for pine plantations. And so based on this sort of rough data, you could probably work out your own emissions, although, as I said, the national inventory values are average and they don't differentiate between stock classes. So, for example, in real life, 100 weaners would emit less methane and nitrous oxide than 100 mixed-age stags. But remember, now we're in 2021, operating under He Waka Econo and the Zero Carbon Act, and the main difference is that we now have different treatments for methane and nitrous oxide. So earlier this year, He Waka Econo released a report that evaluated 7 tools that could estimate on-farm emissions and tested them across 10 different farming systems. 3 of those tools were suitable for the one Southland deer farm that was used in the study, and the results are summarised here. So Farmax, there's a Ministry for the Environment spreadsheet, and overseerfm, and you can just see the range. Just ignore the methane and the nitrous oxide table and just look at the total at the end, but you can see the spread there. And as you can see, the variation between these tools is quite large. The overseer total is about 60% more than the MFE Spreadsheet total. Also, just last week, Beef and Lamb have released Yardstick, a tool which also calculates sheep, beef and deer greenhouse gases. And this will be evaluated alongside more tools soon by He Waka Econo.
Any idea of what's creating such a variance between, say, overseer and farming?
The suspicion amongst I suppose the coordinators of this bit of work was Ag First, and their suspicion was that it's probably operator error. So essentially, the model, the tool providers actually did all the work. Farm data was supplied to the tool providers, and they put in that work. If you go onto the website and download the report, you'll see there's a number of different sheep and beef systems, some dairy grazing farms as well, and the spread between those 3 tools is by and large is mostly less than what we see with the deer farm situation.
Hang on, sorry, just wait. Microphone, turn on microphone.
Yeah, Lindsay, that's quite an urgent matter to address, and I mean really urgent,
yes,
because a number of us are doing GHG numbers in our region and around the country.
Yep.
And we'd prefer not to have to jump to other tools.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, we're well aware that large variation, does create some issues, and whether or not you can whether or not you can adjust those numbers through operator input will be an interesting exercise to look at. But yeah, so going into those three tools, some farmers will already have an overseer stimulation for their farms, probably as a result of freshwater regulations in places like Canterbury or Lake Rotorua. And if so, then you'll already have your greenhouse gas number and your overseer result. So job done, no need to sort of delve into it any more at this point in time.
Oh, just a quick query on that early slide you had about the number of hectares to offset for 100 animals. So if anyone does that, sums on their farm is a rough thing. Your farm hasn't got near it. It takes about 10 times the size of your farm to offset your animals, roughly speaking. Yeah.
So this was just a very sort of initial look by the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment back in 2016. And remember, when the government was talking about going into the ETS, it was talking about looking at a 5% exposure or a 95% sort of free allocation. So you've got to look at that and sort of think, well, actually, the amount, if you were trying to account for all the for the emissions that you're going to be priced on, then offsetting of that 5% is probably what you need to concentrate on. But this has all been to some degree sort of superseded by what we're dealing with now. So with overseer, it's the gold standard. It does require a large number of inputs, usually done by a consultant or a fertiliser rep. Some greenhouse gas good management practices can be included, but on the flip side, there's an annual licence fee that the farmer has to pay. Farmax, similarly, it requires a consultant to do it. But it also includes budgeting and financial analysis, which is the main and original purpose of the tool. So the last tool which was evaluated, the MFE Spreadsheet, it's a pretty basic approach and it's free. You can download it from the MFE website, and it has and when you do, it's got a workbook with a number of different spreadsheets in it, including agriculture. But there are only just three categories of inputs: land area, head of stock, and kilograms of fertiliser. So it's a pretty simple sort of calculator. So here's just some screenshots from that spreadsheet. So you can see land area there, head of stock classes, and then if you go a bit further down, there's kilograms of fertiliser there. So remember, this is free, but it doesn't, unlike the other overseer and Farmax, it doesn't take into account good management practices or more efficient feeding, but it's free.
So that MFE calculator wouldn't take into account any fuel consumption or
They've got different tabs where they look at transport and things like that. So at the moment, we're really just focusing in on the livestock emissions, and so that tab there will cover all of that.
But so what I'm sort of getting at is maybe that's the big difference between overseer FM up there and your MFE spreadsheet is the MFE spreadsheet making it too basic and not taking into account what overseer is, or not? Would that be too much of it?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. That could be the case, but yeah, I'm not sure about that. So, yeah. So those results were only from one farm in Southland, and only 10 farms in total were taken. So you have to take this with reasonable sort of level of caution. What about other dairy farm systems? In 2019, we commissioned AgFirst to look at 4 real farms, and I think there's about 3 of the farmers present here from those farms. And we got them to model greenhouse gas emissions using overseer, look at carbon stored in woody vegetation, and look at possible ways to reduce emissions. So there's a sort of a summary of the description of the farms at the top there. On a per hectare basis, all of those farms had fewer emissions than the Southland farm that was used in the last study. But we can't really truly compare these two studies. But I think that our 2019 results, if you look at that far far column of those farms at the bottom, and then look at the latest report.
Was the 2016 one before they fixed the nitrous oxide problem in Overseer?
Yes, it was. Yep. Yeah, but I mean, they do look a bit more close to that Farm X result than the Overseer result. Particularly if you look at Farm 1, which is 10.9 stock units per hectare, the same as the Southland study. Interestingly, for the carbon storage side of the farms, and leaving aside ETS eligibility criteria, farms are able to offset between 7 and 62% of their annual emissions. So that's the sort of key areas there. This is reported over the total emissions over the farms rather than the previous slide, which looked at per hectare basis. But if we look at Farm 4, which was the most intensive farm, that also had a sizable forestry block, which accounts for its ability to offset 20% of the emissions. And then conversely, Farm 3, which was the least intensive farm, South Island High Country Farm, 3 stock units per hectare, that had very little option to increase woody vegetation without leading to a drop in stock numbers. And that was due to its location. And I suppose theoretically it could it could intensify through irrigation and fertilisation. But that, again, due to its location, that actually wasn't an option due to freshwater regulations and district council regulations. So what else can you do? In terms of reducing emissions, as opposed to offsetting them, Ag First ran through a number of options that were theoretically acceptable to the farmers. And you can just scan your eye down those different options and how they applied to those individual farms. But you'll notice that most of them only gave very modest reductions and in all likelihood would not have been adopted by the farmers as being cost-effective ways. Now, this actually supports other desktop research that has been done in the past, not for deer farming per se, but just dry stock farming in general. And that also notes that for extensive livestock farming with no ability to control feed type or intake or introduce additives to the feed, there are actually very few mitigation options available. So under current technology, the only other way to reduce emissions is to produce the same amount of venison and velvet from less feed. In other words, bring out more productive efficiency and reduce wastage. And I think that's something that the industry's been looking at for quite a number of years now. So, yeah, nothing particularly new there. So what can DINZ do? What more can we do? That's what I've just described. That's the current state of play for calculating greenhouse gas emissions on deer farms. We've got 4 tools that can do the job, but with varying levels of complexity and expense. Where farms have the ability to grow woody vegetation, there is some scope to offset those emissions, but we've got limited ability to reduce emissions other than operate as efficiently as we can. We do still have some more work to do, and we intend to revisit those 4 2019 case study farms and run those 4 tools that Waka Econo has used across them. So that's Farm X, Overseer, the spreadsheet and yardstick now that it's come out. So that will give us a better feel for cost effectiveness and strengths and weaknesses of those tools rather than just sort of rely on that one Southland deer farm. We are also committed to helping our farmers know their number through the existing activities. So that's, I think maybe tomorrow Phil might talk a bit more about the Natural Knowledge Project. We can run workshops. We've got our environment groups and advanced parties. And of course, Beef and Lamb will be running a whole series of events as well. So we generally get looped into that as well. We do think that this is important because while we don't yet know the final price of the emissions, knowing the number will give you a starting point of determining if you'll face a small financial problem or a large liability. So please let us know what we can do to help you with this. Thank you.
Lindsay, I know it's been asked before, but I couldn't really remember the answer to it. Why is pasture not taken into consideration for offsetting?
So, yeah, that's a very common question, and sort of at first blush you'd sort of think, yeah, it should be, right? The explanation is that it's carbon dioxide pulled out from the atmosphere, becomes carbohydrate within the grass, an animal eats that, digests it, and then burps out methane. So methane is much more potent as a greenhouse gas in terms of warming effect than carbon dioxide. So at the time that it's methane, you're getting a much greater effect. And then after a while, that methane then breaks down and carbon dioxide's formed. And so that part is quite neutral. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide pulled out by the plant, that sort of all cancels itself out. But the time that it exists as methane, it has a disproportionate effect on warming. Yep.
Yeah, I've got a question here, Lindsay. When you calculate the gross emissions, methane emissions, do you take into account that the methane disappears in, say, 12 years' time, that it decays?
Yeah, so in terms of when we get to start to price emissions, that's... So I think what you're getting at is the debate around GWP 100 or GWP star or any other metric.
Yeah, exactly, because I think the problem is really we can plant a tree to sequester the methane, but in 12 years' time, the tree's just starting to grow and methane's gone.
Yep. So I think the advantage now that we're talking about a split gas approach is that we can actually focus in on methane, and we still need to have a discussion or a debate between government and industry about what is the right metric to use for methane. Is it GWP 100? Is it GWP star?
It would have to be GWP star, and that would completely change those numbers that you add up.
So this is a position that industry are looking at quite seriously, and so that's part of our discussions within here Waka Econo. Yep, definitely.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we just have a show of hands? So everybody who's from a farm, can you put your hand up in the audience, please? So we just have a rough righto. And so leave them up and put your hand down if you have an overseer file for your farm or you have measured in some way the emissions that are coming off.
That's
right. So would that be about half? Do you reckon?
At least, yeah.
Yeah. That's got to be a step in the right direction, didn't it?
That's good. Yeah.
Lindsay, just a question about yardstick. Have you had a look at that, and how does it compare to MFE FarmX and the other system, the overseer system?
So not me myself, but Phil can probably provide some.
We haven't had a close look at it because it was released last Friday. So, but this Friday in a place called Hawke's Bay, we're going to give it a bench test with a group of deer farmers. So we'll know a lot more after that, and perhaps we can write something up to get a message out to farmers. But yardstick's been around for a wee while, but the GHG calculator on the front end of it, or the back end, which way you look at it, is new. So, and it'll be once it's fully out, it'll be a free online tool for farmers as well. So
you might have had a sneak preview.
I have had a sneak preview, but it's a relatively simple tool in that you don't need to rat through gathering lots of information to then feed into it. So, but we haven't evaluated it alongside the other tools. So, I'm hopeful it'll be a good option for us.
Yeah, Lindsay, I'm a bit slow on the uptake, and I think I was hoping this was going to go away, but...
we all do.
Yeah. If worst case scenario, I'm going to have to pay $50,000, where does that go? Does it go to farm rural support, or what happens?
Yeah. So under He Waka Econo, one of the things that we have talked about, and we've got some broad agreement, but again, it's going to come down to all the detail, is that if we are extracting a price on emissions from farmers, we want that, which is essentially a levy, as opposed to a tax. But we want this to be a levy that then goes back into a pool of funds that goes to support farmers to do things like look at where, at its, I suppose at a very high level, it could be around mental health support, but at a detailed level, it could be around funding assistance to increase native plantings or something that might be used to offset some of the greenhouse gases or adopt good management practices that might lead to reductions in greenhouse gases. So, if new technology arises around vaccines, then making vaccines affordable. So the money that's collected is intended to be as a levy that goes towards farmer on farm activity.
So who would decide that? It's unknown at this stage.
Yeah, totally unknown. Yeah. Yeah. Let's form a committee.
Yeah. Hi, Lindsay. We talk a lot about the GHG numbers, and I see as we go through the process, first of all, we've got to understand it in more detail. Then we get a calculator to do the numbers, and then mitigations is the critical because we're going to be paying 5% at the outset in dollars, depending on what our number is. So my understanding is that it's a chapter 4, mitigations in the policy space are being floated around up in Wellington, and there's a lot of work that needs to happen on those proposed mitigations. What is difficult on farm is we're starting to get our heads around this and make some pretty big decisions on what we're going to do, yet the mitigation policy decisions are still uncertain.
Yes.
So timing on this, progression, when can we expect to get certainty? And it's got robust certainty, not one with unintended consequences. Yeah.
Robust certainty. Gosh. So Waka Econo needs to develop an on-farm pricing system that includes so the pricing will be on kilograms of methane, kilograms of nitrous oxide, and there'll be probably some pricing differentials between them. And then netting off that would be carbon stored. And so there has to be a whole lot of recognition of what's in and what's out in terms of carbon stored and what price that would be. So again, there is a debate around actually we don't really want to see a whole lot of pines everywhere, and maybe incentivizing native plantings over pines might be something which could be worthwhile exploring. So these things are on the table. But we do need to have a system up in place by end of 2023, I think it is, and then start to test that out in 2024 with the idea that a pricing system will come in 2025. So, quite soon.
Some time ago, Lindsay, you'll probably remember, I passed on some information about research done in the UK from a reputable establishment. And that was that mixed pasture systems, which is the New Zealand system, clover and mixed grasses, actually produced or resulted in 40% less nitrous oxide than the figures that are being used as a standard now. You passed it on.
Yep.
They said they didn't know about it.
Yes.
40% reduction in nitrous oxide for New Zealand is pretty bloody big.
Yep.
We should be hearing about more of this sort of stuff.
Yes. No, thanks for that, Graham. And I guess I'd have to admit that I passed it on. They said, this is interesting. So this was sent to the Pastoral Greenhouse Gas Research Consortium. I do need to follow that up as to whether or not they've sort of looked at it and said, yep, there's some legs to this, or actually we think that this is already accounted for in the New Zealand approach. So, thanks for that.
Just like to make another comment on the previous question. You might also want to look at some of the work by Dr. Christine Jones and some of the work that was done in Texas that suggested that up to 30 to 70% of that carbohydrate went down into the roots and some even leaked into the soil. Now, this may be looking at slightly different grazing regimens that we're used to, but 30 to 70%, as opposed to back into the atmosphere to methane, it would be some hope on the horizon as well.
Yep, no, that's all really good information. Thank you, and that those sorts of observations have been aired. I guess it's fair to say that politically speaking, soil carbon accumulation is off the table at the moment because it's so it's variable, it's expensive to measure. There's lots of, I suppose, things that probably do need to be quantified in a more robust manner. That's not to say that it won't be there in the future, and we have actually made strong representation about actually where people, for example, arable farmers, might have years worth, decades worth of good soil information that should be able to count for something. So we certainly have made that representation, but we do, on the flip side, we do have, I suppose, the counter-argument that if we say for the arable people, right, you're in, what does that mean for the hill country farmer who suddenly gets a slip one year or there's a drought, and soil carbon is lost that way? So, yeah, there's still a lot of things to sort of try and firm up in these sorts of quite dynamic systems.